Good morning and welcome to this, the 14th meeting of 2013 of the European and External Relations Committee. Can I make the usual request that all mobile phones and electronic devices are switched off because they interfere with our broadcasting? And can I first off give apologies for Helen Eadie, who is chairing another committee this morning, and hopefully Hans Al will be here. We've not had apologies yet, so hopefully he will be here. We have only one item on our agenda today, but a very, very important item on our agenda today, and something that this committee has taken a great interest in. We have with us today the EU Anti-Trafficking Coordinator, I believe the very first EU Anti-Trafficking Coordinator, a role which is appointed by the European Commission. As I said, it's a new role created by the Commission to take responsibility for improving coordination between the EU and international agencies involved in the prevention of human trafficking. And if anyone knows anything about human trafficking, you know that this has to be tackled cross borders, so it's excellent to have an EU Commissioner, coordinator. So we have Maria Vassiliadou with us this morning. Yes. I was going to say Calimera, and welcome to Scotland. I believe you have an opening statement for us, and if you want to just go ahead with that, we'll then go to questions.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the Calimera to all of you. I'm very honored to be here with you today, and thank you very much for joining today for this, only for this item on the agenda that indeed I think is extremely important. I'm here very simply to convey the message of how important, fundamental it is to implement the EU legislation against trafficking in human beings. And I will talk just a little bit about that. I won't take too much of your time. Hopefully we'll have more time to talk. But just to tell you that the way that we look at it now at the EU level is that trafficking in human beings is fundamentally a human rights violation, and it is a serious form of organized crime. And I want to clarify how we understand trafficking in human beings. Of course, there's the legal framework and the legal definition, but to put it very simply, this is about people who live under appalling conditions, who work or provide services to others against their will, with absolutely no choice to escape, and whose lives are often in danger, whose families are threatened, and who often disappear. So I would like, first of all, to clarify that I'm not here to talk about regular or irregular migration, about people smuggling, about undocumented workers. I'm here to talk about people who live in slavery-like conditions in today's Europe. So within this context, I am very happy that we have this EU legislation that was adopted in 2011. The member states were very keen on this legislation. They adopted it in record time. It's very ambitious. After Lisbon, is the most ambitious criminal law instrument that we have, and it's very comprehensive because historically we've thought of trafficking as a crime and let the law enforcement deal with it, which of course is very important. But it's not the only thing we have to do. We have to deal with preventing it from happening altogether. We have to prosecute the traffickers, that's for sure, and convict them. We have to protect and assist the victims, and we have to make sure that they reintegrate in society. And this is what this EU legislation tries to do. Up to date, the deadline for the translation into national law, the transposition, was the 6th of April this year. Up to now, we have had 14 member states out of now 28, with Croatia, that have notified the Commission of transposition. The UK has decided to opt in, and we very much welcome that. And the UK has notified of transposition of this directive. Of course, what our job is to do now is, number one, to study what this notification means and whether the EU law is mirrored into the national law. And the next step, of course, the most important part that we all have a joint responsibility towards is to ensure prompt implementation. Because unlike a lot of other I would say a lot of other EU instruments, and there's different debates on Europe, and that I take, and it's not my job to engage in that. But I can tell you that this is one area that the EU member states are very keen to work together on. And they are very keen to work together on because there's no other way. Because this is a transnational form of organized crime, and unless the member states join forces, there's no way that you can decrease, let alone eradicate the phenomenon. I also think that there's no member state that wish to be seen as, ignoring modern-day slavery. And of course, this is also about following money trails, and this is where I think that the member states should also be focusing on. I said before that this is a serious form of organized crime. According to the UN, it provides up to $32 billion of profits, so about 25 billion euro of profits a year to the traffickers. So we have to follow the money, we have to do thorough financial investigations, and we have to ensure better prosecution and convictions. What we do is that we mirror this EU legislation with a policy framework. This policy framework is the EU strategy against trafficking in human beings that was adopted by the European Commission. It includes about 40 actions. I will not bore you with all the actions, but most of the actions are for the European Commission to be responsible for, but there's also actions for the member states that we recommend. It is one of the rare instances where EU policy has been taken on by the member states fully. So there are council conclusions where the member states basically mirror the EU strategy, and they adopt it in these conclusions, and they commit to carry out a number of actions. And I'm very pleased to see that. So in some ways, my job is extremely difficult because I'm after $32 billion, but it's also very easy because it is one of those areas that I think people want to work together, or at least they say they want to work together. So we have to see how they implement what they say. Just to give you some numbers, first of all, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, talks about an absolute conservative estimate of 880,000 people in forced labor in Europe in the last decade. Out of those people, we have had a Eurostat first report, so the member states collected information on identified and presumed victims, and we have an embarrassing number of only 23,000 victims identified. I think that this is not even the tip of the iceberg. There are hundreds of thousands of people in Europe today that are trafficked. Our data suggests that 62% of them are trafficked for, identified, are trafficked for sexual exploitation. This is women and girls. And the rest are trafficked for other forms of exploitation that increasingly, the list is becoming very long. So we have labor exploitation, construction workers in the agricultural sector, domestic work, in the healthcare sector, and so on. But also trafficking for benefit fraud, increasingly for engaging in criminal activities, being forced into engaging in criminal activities. They are trafficked for the purpose of organ removal. The list is just horrifying, and it's getting longer and longer. The additional problem is that although the number of victims identified is higher, the number of prosecutions and eventual convictions is going down. And this is where the member states have, I think, a very important role to play. The other thing that might be of interest to this committee is that 61% of the victims that we identified, that the member states identified, are EU citizens. So there are EU citizens being trafficked in the EU. So a lot of the times we tend to think that something that happens very far away from us. But it's very likely. I always say, if there's 1 million people estimated to be trafficked in Europe, then there's another 1 million people who know exactly where these people are in some ways. We're all responsible for that, and we're all responsible for doing something about it. Our directive and our policy framework, actually my role is a strange one, if you like, because it's an article in the EU directive. And it's not about the importance of what I do, but it is about the importance that the member states decided to convey to this issue. So there's two people in this type of role in different capacities, one working on terrorism and the other on anti-trafficking. And I think this speaks volumes about how the different member states want to work together on these issues. So the directive and the legislative framework stipulate that all the work we need to do in very close collaboration with civil society. And this is not just a lot of jargon. It is because victims are very likely to come into contact with the victims first. So they need to have a role in helping identifying the victims, assisting the victims, protecting the victims, and eventually helping them reintegrate into society. The whole spirit and ethos of this strategy and this policy framework is to work together. So we cannot get this done if only the police is involved, even if they're doing an excellent job. You need labor inspectorates to work together, border guards, consular services, of course the civil society. We need anybody who might come into contact with victims to work together, and systematically so. When it comes to the civil society, what we have done is that we have launched an EU civil society platform. It's 100 NGOs. I spoke to, I think, about 10 NGOs from Scotland yesterday. Because we want to, number one, ensure that they're aware of the EU's legislative and policy framework, and also because they're the ones that can help us and tell us how best to do our job and build better policy. So, and also because it is in the directive. I also wanted to highlight to them yesterday, and this is what we also did with the platform, the document that you have in front of you with the rights of victims. This is no new rights, no new decisions or anything like that, but it is about explaining how far the member states separately, but the EU together, has come in ensuring that these victims are protected from, I think, 17 or 18 different pieces of legislation. And I think this is an area that is very useful. It's not about saying, oh, exposing the member states, there's all these rights. But it is about facilitating the work that is being done, because this is about slaves. This is not about any other kind of issues that we might have a debate on. So you have it there in front of you. It's translated in all the 23 languages, precisely because we want to reach out to NGOs, we want to reach out to victims themselves and help them escape or help them reintegrate into society. What might be of particular interest to you is the external dimension of the work that we do. I have the responsibility of working with third countries and international organizations. What we have is that, of course, most of the victims tend to come from particular third countries. Most of the victims from third countries are identified in 10 third countries. So we have the external action of the Union. We have what we call the action-oriented paper. It's a member state document. It's not a commission document, where they have come together and agreed on the 10 countries based on a number of criteria that the Commission and the Union and the member states have to strengthen efforts with. Some of them are countries neighboring the EU, like the Ukraine and Russia, and others further away, like Nigeria, like China, like Vietnam. Some of these countries may be familiar to you in terms of the work that you do and where the victims may be coming from. So at the moment, we're working very hard with the External Action Service and our member states to see how best to ensure more coordinated work with these countries. At the end of the day, it is about how funding is allocated, and I think this is also a concern of this committee, because I think it's something that you identify with as well. We have different ministries, different services doing very good work, but often parallel work in different policy areas. In the area of trafficking, because I have the privilege to have this task, what I have done is I have tried to gather all the funding that has gone into trafficking, against trafficking human beings from all the different sectors of the EU, from development, enlargement, and so on. And of course, the crime prevention and reduction. And it is staggering now we're gathering to the actual amount. It's the first time that it's been done in a policy area at the EU level, and we intend to publish that. And we don't want to do it to say, oh, look how much has been allocated. It's never enough if we're going to help people. But we need to do it in a better way, in a more accountable way, and in a more coordinated way, so that it has an impact. So what we're doing now is we're evaluating we're going to assess and do a policy review of all the projects that have ever been funded at the EU level. What do they say? What do they want us to do? And how do we ensure better policy making and better use of that funding to match the policy needs and the needs of the victims? And the other thing we're doing, we're also assessing, we're evaluating awareness-raising campaigns that we have funded and that the member states have funded. Because, of course, every NGO will say, well, give us this amount of money and we'll publish posters. Are they helpful? I don't know. Have they had an impact? I don't really know. All I see is that we have a lot more trafficking than before, or at least we know of it. So I think we need to look into that harder and ask questions about how to do our job better in the future. And I want to close by saying to you that there's no trafficking unless there is demand for trafficking. That somebody is buying the products, somebody is using the services of these victims. Most of these victims are recruited online, social networking, temporary work agencies, intermediaries working online. How do we address this issue of demand? So the legislation actually is a very strange animal, this legislation, if you like, because it's more of a soft law approach in this Article 18 that obliges member states to take action to reduce demand. There's also a provision that says that in 2016, I have to contribute to this report where we see whether what measures member states have taken, they're not obliged, to criminalize the use of services made who knowingly use by clients who knowingly use the services of victims of trafficking. So it is about victims of trafficking, is not a broader debate. So the issue of demand is a fundamental one, not only for sexual exploitation, for labor exploitation, and that's why we're launching a European business coalition in 2014. We want to engage with the private sector. We want cleaner supply chains. We want to see more ethical practices by the private sector, more awareness by the consumers, by clients, and as I say, a very clinical way of looking at this. I say this to the business sector. It hurts legitimate business practices. It hurts the way we conduct our business. And if you don't want to think about the victims, and I hope this is our priority, but if this is not something we think about, the financial element of that is also very important. So we need to be, the member states need to be following the money. This is not something the EU can do. Everything I said is on the Commission website. I'm very keen and committed to ensuring that we're very accountable in what we do. So every single project that has been funded at the EU level is now on a central website. You can find anything there. We will publish there where the money has gone and where the money will go in the future and how it fits into policy. So thank you very much for your time and for inviting me today.
Thank you very, very much for that very comprehensive and detailed account of the work that you're doing. And I think you come to your committee where we have taken quite an interest in the transposition of the directive and maybe nudged the UK government in the right direction in some of this. But one of the questions that I wanted to ask for you was about your work with member states. And if you look at what's happened in the UK now, the UK government's announced a modern slavery bill. The Scottish Government, because our legal system is different in Scotland and justice has devolved, the Cabinet Secretary here has now agreed to look at that bill to see if we could just adopt some of the practices right across the UK because it gives us that cross-border coordination. The other thing that we have in Scotland is a dedicated anti-trafficking unit, and we have a criminal justice and licensing bill going through right now which actually makes it an aggravated crime, which then obviously allows us to convict traffickers easier. One of the other things that we're doing is we are in a big debate about whether we should abolish corroboration, which is one of the things that is usually the stumbling block to getting, you know, a sound conviction. What I think we would be looking for is there anything else that we could be doing that you think we could be doing alongside the member state, which is the UK, but in Scots law as well?
Well, thank you. I mean, of course, this is the key question, and I can there's a number of things here. The first thing is that, as I said, the UK has notified the transposition of this directive. What we are doing at the moment is that we are, of course, collecting all this information, and notification of transposition is one thing, but then the Commission needs to check the extent to which really the national law complies, the member state law complies with the EU law. So this is the next step. At the EU level, we're doing our job much faster than we normally would, because normally we take a long time to wait, it's taken time, we need to adopt, we need to transpose, and so on. But actually, the Commissioner and myself were very keen to do a very quick job on this. So we sent non-communication letters to the member states who haven't notified yet, and we're going to be launching the exercise to study the transposition very quickly, and then launching infringement procedures that we don't tend to do normally for sometimes years. But this is not going to take years because there's people's lives at stake, so we can't afford to wait years. Now, so this was a lengthy way to tell you that I cannot comment on the bill because on the bill of the UK government, the modern slavery bill. I think is it? Am I using the right word? Yeah. Because first of all, the EU directive is about minimum standards, and it is about compliance. So my question would be, as a next step, does this proposal fully comply with the directive? Now, if it goes beyond, all the better. But does it fully comply? And in my eyes, and this is a big responsibility for parliamentarians, for decision makers, for politicians, is to push and ensure for the implementation of that directive. And I really think that this is not me doing the EU thing, it is really going to make a difference to people's lives. So I think what we can do, and this is why I very much welcome being here today, the more the interest and the pressure that this committee exerts on the Scottish authorities more broadly as well, I think the more able we will be to do our job and to do it well. Because the only thing I can do at my end is check whether the directive is fully implemented. And the other thing I can tell you is that when it comes to such areas as convictions and prosecutions, I mean, what can the EU do? It is really up to you to push in that direction. Because when we estimate hundreds of thousands of victims in Northern Europe, and then we come up with numbers like 10 convictions, this is dreadful. And this is where we have to be focusing. So conducting financial investigations, holding different authorities accountable, for me, would be fundamental. There's also the questions that I know, a question that will probably come up and relates to that relates to Article 19 of the legislation on the national rapporteurs or equivalent mechanisms, which is basically, there is a need to establish this national rapporteur or equivalent mechanism. And their job is to report on trends, to collect data, to ensure the collection of data, to assess the impact of national actions, and then to report to the EU level, and then we will draft our own report then. Now, there is nothing in the legislation stipulating that there has to be an independent body doing that. Independence means different things, both geographically, but also in terms of what independence means in different places and in different bodies. There is nothing in the directive that stipulates that. So what an independent rapporteur might mean in my country and in this country might be two different things. But what I can tell you is that there are a number of obligations for these bodies that are stipulated in the legislation. We're working with the representative of these bodies now, because there's representatives for these bodies coming. I'm chairing a meeting with all these people in Brussels twice a year, and we're trying to come up with a kind of guidelines on what they need to work on and report based on what they want. It's not up to me to decide, but it's up to them to decide. Now, the more coordination there is, the better. The more representation from different areas and stakeholders, the more it is important. Because if we are to have the police representing the police, reporting about the police, we've had that for 20 years. And the point is to move further than that. So we need to have the different stakeholders involved. What that means in the context, the geographical and political context that you are in, this is, of course, for you to decide.
Okay, thank you. You actually preempted my next quick question, was really just to express my disappointment the UK government has not appointed a rapporteur, and obviously you've expressed your feelings on that. I'm going to go to open questions for our committee members, and Jamie McGregor is first up. Jamie.
Thank you. You're obviously much closer to this subject than most people, and you know much more about it. In those sort of terms, are there examples of best practice from elsewhere in Europe that Scotland could learn from in the effort to combat human trafficking? That's the first point. And is there a great deal of evidence that human trafficking is taking place in Scotland that you know of? And the third thing I wanted to ask was, you mentioned, apart from the sex industry, agriculture, healthcare, benefit fraud, and labour. How does the average person identify the signals, or what are the signs that somebody might actually be being trafficked that perhaps the ordinary person could pick up?
Thank you. Very good questions. I'm actually not the expert. I think I'm surrounded and privileged to be surrounded by a lot of experts, and what I'm trying to do is ensure that they're better placed together to do the work, try to coordinate. So I don't assume expertise on every area on trafficking, but I know a little bit about it. So in terms of best practices, I would say that there are different best practices in different countries. For example, I'll give you an example I had last week. We have the EU Anti-Trafficking Day on the 18th of October, that I understand in the UK also is the day against slavery. And we have an event with experts working on the internet because we want to understand a lot more about internet recruitment. So we sent invitation to the member states, and in most member states, the people working on cybercrime and the people who work on against trafficking human beings in the law enforcement field don't know each other. There are countries, though, I cannot tell you names now, but I'm happy to send names, that not only they work together, but they have regular meetings in order to coordinate their work. So we had replies from member states saying, oh, who do we send? Somebody from the cybercrime unit or somebody from the anti-trafficking unit? And I said, well, they decide among themselves. They don't know each other. So there's the good practice, those who do work together and those who don't. There's also good practices in terms of how the work is done on the identification of victims. So what we call national referral mechanisms. What that means in the context of the UK, I don't know. But national referral mechanisms is not just the police identifying victims, because then it won't happen, because it hasn't happened in 20 years. It won't happen a lot. But it is when different frontline officials and services coordinate in a very systematic manner in order for the identification to take place in close cooperation with civil society. So we have member states where such national referral mechanisms work very well, and the different stakeholders are very happy with the way that it works. Then I'll give you an example from the UK. It happens to be from the UK, but it could be from anywhere. Last year in the Anti-Trafficking Day, we had an ex-victim of trafficking for labor exploitation who happens to be a UK citizen, a guy in his 20s who was trafficked in Sweden and then came back, and then he managed to escape, etc. So I was sitting there. He gave his testimony. I was sitting there doing blah, blah, and explaining, and then he came during the break and he said to me, I don't know what you're talking about, but, when I went there, when I was identified as a victim, I was sent from that authority to the other. Nobody knew my rights. I didn't know my rights. Nobody told me anything. It's not the UK. I'm just saying this was the example because, at least it was a good example because he was identified. But there's thousands of examples like that. So, but there's also examples of people who say, I went to the service and I was helped and I managed to reintegrate into society. But these are very, very, very few examples. The examples of people becoming re-trafficked are a lot more, I'm afraid. So there's a lot of examples like that. So it depends on the area in which we're speaking. And I think we don't have enough examples where the parliamentarians, where the decision makers are proactive in taking an interest in the matter. So I welcome that, and I think we should have a lot more of that. In terms of the evidence, if you're asking me about numbers, I cannot give you separate numbers to what we have in the Eurostat report. If you're asking me when I spoke to the people yesterday across the room, the 10 people, they all had examples. They all knew. Some were talking about hundreds of people, but they helped. And then I think, okay, I don't think the NGO would be lying. Why would they be lying that they had 500 people? And then you look at the convictions, 3. I don't know about Scotland. I'm just saying that they were saying about the different areas and so on. So there's something there. I'm not saying that Scotland has a worse or a better situation, because that I don't know. But what I do know is that there's certainly a lot of people out there that are not identified, and that I am sure of. How do we identify? I think for frontline officials, the EU directive and our policy actually provide for training. And when I say training, I don't mean 1 hour that let's all get together and talk about trafficking, but judges, prosecutors, the police, NGOs, labor inspectors need to have very focused training on identifying these people. We had a meeting with an informal network of labor inspectorates from across the member states, and it was the first time, it was last April, it was the first time they discussed trafficking human beings, and most of them were looking in amazement about how do they relate to the issue. And I actually had to push for us to have a place in the agenda. And we have hundreds of people, if not hundreds of thousands, that are trafficked in this way. So before we even go to the average citizen, there's that. But then when we come to citizens, I think it is about creating more awareness, and it is our responsibility in different areas of decision-making and responsibility to ensure that there is a lot more awareness about what we buy, the products we consume. When we go, I keep saying that these people in the street that we see and we think we assume, we make a lot of assumptions about, you know, oh, it's just a person begging or whatever, or even thieves or people mugging in the streets. Sometimes they do that, and they should be punished. There's other areas where we have, you know, criminal networks around them. So understanding demand is a fundamental priority, and the EU at the moment is focusing very much on that. Also, this demand online, you know, understanding, you know, who advertises, you know, for people to get these jobs. Who is there? Who responds to that? Who applies? What are the processes that lead to these people getting the jobs? But also is more responsible consumers, I think, is fundamental.
Yeah. Rod Campbell.
Morning, Kavita. I've got a couple of questions. First question I'd just like to probe is the question, notwithstanding the UK doesn't have a national reporter, a national rapporteur would be charged with collection of data. Do you have any views on the collection of data either within the UK or within Scotland, or at the very least could you give us a view as to what you think would be best practice in terms of the collection of data on human trafficking?
Okay, I would say that apart from the convictions, this is the number 2 most difficult task, the collection of data. Number 1, because it is a hidden form of crime. So, of course, we are talking about organized criminality predominantly, and in all areas of organized crime, it's difficult to have the data. Having said that, it is extremely important that there is coordination amongst the different bodies that are able to collect data, to systematically ensure that they keep each other informed, because there is often the situation that you know, civil society or border guards or whoever it is, consular services that, by the way, they don't think they have anything to do with this, labor inspectors and so on, they don't communicate with each other. There's differences in definitions on how they understand that. There's issues of data protection and so on. So that prevents in many ways, unless these are clarified and we have very clear definitions and we abide by the legislation, the EU legislation, that prevent us from collecting better data. The encouraging part is that this applies to the UK as well. I don't think we have separate statistics for Scotland. I don't think so. In 2008, we had a lot worse quality of data, if you like, but also types of data collected than in 2010. In that sense, I think we are progressing in understanding how best to collect this data and how to ensure that we have better definitions. But we are far from doing our job. And what we are doing now is we're working with the UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Organized Crime, to see how we can coordinate our work together and ensure better collection of data and more coordinated work. Because I think what the administrations also suffer from is fatigue, you know, report after report after report. But if the UNODC report goes to this authority, and then the Eurostat report goes to the National Statistical Authority, actually what you end up is sometimes different data. And this is an indication of where part of the problem lies. Of course, the biggest part is because it's hidden form of crime. But we have a lot of work to do in that sense. But we started doing it, and I think it was quite courageous because, of course, we were expecting a lot of criticism. We didn't get that, actually, because I think everybody is struggling with the same issue. So at least there seems to be a lot of willingness to do a better job this time. And we launched an activity 1 month ago. So basically, we sent the questionnaire to all the member states, and we're waiting to see what this new exercise brings.
Thank you. My second question is one of the most interesting things I heard this morning, indeed I heard it yesterday when you were addressing the Justice Conference, is it surprised me when you said that 61% of people trafficked have been identified as European citizens, which is a very high figure, much higher than I had anticipated. Given kind of general rules on freedom of labour, indeed freedom of movement throughout the European Union, that figure being so high, it poses particular problems for member states generally because of the freedom of movement rules. Have you any thoughts on that?
I think that human trafficking is caused by vulnerability. It is caused by people who are in conditions of poverty, and they are socially excluded. I think the emphasis should be there, and I think this can happen to, as I said before, UK citizens being trafficked into in the UK, and this happens. I also think that, don't forget that all the other victims, so we're talking about hundreds of thousands of victims, come from outside the Union. And I think when it comes to organized networks, unfortunately, this kind of restrictions seem to have made little difference. We don't have less people being trafficked from outside Europe. We also have other people being trafficked. That's one thing to take into consideration. So where the restrictions are, in which area, that's one thing to take into consideration. I think migration has, there's something to be said about migration, asylum, and trafficking. Of course, there are links there. But there's also other links, and I think the debate should be focusing on how do we ensure that people who are socially excluded and they live in conditions of vulnerability no longer are in that situation. So.
Yeah, what I was getting at is just the difficulties that member states have with the freedom rules of actually saying, of keeping a proper track of what's happening, people moving across the European Union all the time.
Yes, but that is why I think they're also very keen to work together. And one of the things that we have done at the EU level, we have funded many joint investigation teams. The UK was part of actually quite a successful one, a successful investigation team. There's Europol that can help with intelligence gathering. I think what is lacking is not the issue of what control takes place in the borders, or maybe, I don't know, that's a question that I don't know, but it is how the different police authorities and other authorities coordinate with one another. And I think this is fundamental to address. I think this is not happening enough. And I think there should be more coordination in that sense. And also, I do think that when you think that the Europol director the other day was, not the other day, a few months ago, he was saying now, I think I said it yesterday, so sorry for repeating it for everybody else, he's estimating that there's 3,000 little organized gangs organizing around Europe today. Before, we used to have the heavyweights, the big organized networks, and there were very few. And now there's 3,000 of them all over Europe. So, and they operate in so many flexible ways that it's very hard to control. And they do more than one type of, they don't have my job description. They do all sorts of crime at the same time. Very engaged in drug trafficking as well. So I think there is and also these gangs, they don't just operate in Europe. So the same people who are trafficking people from, I don't know, Romania to Spain are similar people who might be trafficking people from Nigeria to Spain, and they tend to do that very well. So I think there's other questions there that we need to be asking at the same time. So.
Adamson?
Thank you very much. I think this is possibly one of the most important things this committee has looked at. I'm very glad that you're here to share your insight with us today. You've already mentioned about the understanding of the general public about this issue, and this is one of my very great concerns. And while we have big headlines for maybe the cockle pickers who were killed in Morecambe Bay a few years ago, and we had a case of people being killed in a fishing boat that now becomes a home for some people, which is a new phenomenon in Scotland. I do think the general public are genuinely appalled at these situations when they know about them. A local case of mine was a very popular local restaurant where people were discovered to be in the wall cavities sleeping in this restaurant. And I know there was absolute genuine outrage from local people who had, been there enjoying a meal with completely oblivious to what was happening around about them. And that indeed was a case where there was no prosecutions at the end of the day because they were trafficked into the EU, and it was very, very complicated. And I wonder if there's much, much more we should be doing in educating our citizens, and whether there's been any investigation of a possibility of something like the Fair Trade logo. We've already had this issue about provenance of food and the outrage across Europe with the recent scandal with that. But has there been any investigations about maybe having some sort of guarantee of provenance of products in our supermarkets to ensure that trafficking hasn't been involved, or a certification of businesses to give people confidence that when they were purchasing services that had been checked?
Well, first of all, yes, I think making sure, and I think it was in some ways similar also to some of the ideas voiced previously. The issue of how we educate the public is a tough one. It's a tough one because what we've seen, and this is why we want to do this evaluation of awareness-raising activities, is because we want to see what works so that we can do our job better. Because, we have given a lot of money, of course in good faith, and I'm glad this money was given, but we need to see how best to do it. So I don't really have an answer, and that's why we're doing that study on how best to do that. My understanding is that we have to be a lot more targeted. So, of course, one thing, yes, as decision makers, as politicians, we need to ensure that at different fora, this is always voiced and so on. But it can be done in a very targeted way, for example, in schools. For example, in job-seeking centers, or in lots of different fora where we can ensure more awareness. Having said that, the work with the private sector is always a challenge. Obviously, there's only certain limits into what you can do with the private sector. Many people tell me, you do corporate social responsibility, so nothing. In some ways nothing, in some ways not nothing. It is about good practices, and the more the civil society is engaged in that, the more the private sector will be careful, because what kind of business wants to be associated with that? But of course, how far can you track the supply chain back to? The supply chains have become so complex because we were thinking originally, let's have a European business coalition. And I'm being very honest with you, we were thinking, let's do an award for the best business. And then, so this is a good thing. But then we were thinking, can we really check? How far can we check? We can check that they have a good code of conduct, that their workers are paid properly, that they have all the documents and so on. And then how far down the supply chains do we stop? So this issue of the fair trade type of thing, I think is a very interesting idea. I have to say that it's always at the back of my head, but I don't think it's something that's going to happen tomorrow, but I think it would be a very good way of thinking ahead and seeing how best to do that without violating any of the interests of the private sector, of course, and harming legitimate business. But it is something to consider. And I think that actually what was interesting, I think 3 years ago, when I was interviewed for my post, I was doing a lot of reading, and I discovered this Eurobarometer thing, where people were asked in trade, would you be willing to pay 50% more for a product if you knew that there were no people exploited in producing it? And it was so interesting that 78% of the people said yes. So I still have that question, and I intend to show it to the business sector, because they would say, oh, you know, what do you do with that? And I think that's the kind of information that we need. I don't think anybody wants to be associated with human slavery. So I think, yes, that's something to keep in mind. Always keeping in mind in my position the extent to which I can in any way interfere with the work that the business is conducted. So, thank you.
Just a supplementary on that question, is there specific funding available for public awareness education programs?
A very simple yes. A very simple yes. Actually it went all over the place, you know, in development, in enlargement, in employment, in different ways. And there is in DG Home, so in Home Affairs, we don't only fund work on law enforcement anymore, but we fund work on creating better awareness, reducing demand, and so on. I have to say we're a lot more careful in how we distribute that money, but we very much welcome applications. And I'm really proud to say that we have 4 times more applications than we did 2 years ago. And I think this is part of raising awareness to our member states and to all the stakeholders. And we have a lot more new people coming into this work to apply for funds, and 4 times more new NGOs that have been granted funds. It's not that the funds have increased, but I always say we have to move beyond the usual suspects, some of them doing their job very well. But of course, we have, if you like, professionals doing a professional job in, you know how this works, and sometimes they're doing an excellent job. But what I would like to do is reach out throughout the EU, from the Scottish border all the way down to where I originally come from in Cyprus, and make sure that people are involved and aware. This is the only way to do something about it. So.
Okay, Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to you. You said that there are 880,000 or so people involved in this in the European Union. But the number of prosecutions is reducing. Is there something to be said that tells us this policy just is not working and the traffickers are succeeding? And what should we do to try to tackle better the consumers of these services? Can you clarify for us also if people who are consuming these services are committing an offence or not? Because it seems to me that if we're light touch on that, and if people are able to say we didn't know that these people were traffickers, then they can escape punishment. Should we be doing more, do you think, to make it clear to people who use these services that they are indeed committing offences? And is that possibly the best success for us to tackle the consumers of these services in the long term? Because from the figures that you've given us, Mrs. Vassiliadou, it looks as though we are not winning this battle.
Well, thank you. Difficult questions. Thank you. On the policy, I think the policy was not working, because the policy was, there was a framework decision from 2002, so for 10 years, and this is what our member states are doing as well, they looked at this only as a law enforcement issue. And when you look at something like that, that is the police against the traffickers, and you forget about the whole complex phenomenon that human trafficking is, then it is obvious that it will not work, especially with the current financial, if you like, climate and social climate. So this is why this new legislation was adopted, and this is why I'm so much pushing for this to be fully implemented, because, as I said, it's not just about, the police is fundamental, I consider it a core, but it's not just the police trying to go after the trafficker. This is organized criminals. This is huge interest at stake. You need to come from a multidisciplinary approach, if you like, in this, and all the stakeholders together. And I think this policy, I'm not the only one who's convinced on this new policy. This strategy is the first time, normally you go to the European Parliament, and if you're the Commission, people want to shoot you. I go to the European Parliament and people welcome the strategy. the civil society welcomes the strategy. Normally, they don't, because they think that this is the right way ahead. Actually, of course, we are always asked to do more and we should do more, but everybody thinks we're on the same track. So I have to believe that, and I have to try and convince everybody to work in that direction. And I'm convinced that this is the only way to increase convictions and prosecutions. In terms of the consumers and consumers' offense, there's a big debate on that, and it's a very sensitive debate, because there's consumers and there's also clients. Because sometimes it's services, for example, not only when it comes to sexual exploitation, and then there's the consumers, of course, who buy all the products. Article 25, I don't know, of the directive says that in 2016 we have to look at what the practices are in the member states in terms of criminalizing the clients or consumers who knowingly use the services of victims of trafficking. And there's a debate there. Some would argue that, of course, how can you prove that they knowingly use the services or buying products made by victims of trafficking? Others would tell you that if you do that, then people will be it has a normative effect, and people would be 10 times more careful, because the idea that they might be criminalized would make them ask a lot more questions. In the area of sexual exploitation, there are so many different perspectives on that in the member states. I say there's 28 member states, there are 28 different perspectives on how to deal with that, varying from criminalizing all the clients of prostitution to making sure that all people in prostitution are fully and legally protected and so on. There's a gray area in that. I'm not here to comment on that, but I can tell you that this is, for me, if I were a policymaker at the member state level, this is the first thing I would be putting as a debate. The issue of demand, the issue of ensuring that we deal better with consumers and with clients in whatever shape or form that the member state thinks appropriate or the Scottish government thinks appropriate. But I would put my utmost importance there. There is no, pure logistics, pure economics. There is no supply without demand. If we don't deal with demand, we're doing nothing, for me.
Could you just tell me, do you know how many successful prosecutions there have been?
I don't have it in front of me, and I apologize, but it is in the Eurostat report that I'm very happy to submit to this committee to send you. We also have hard copies, but it's also on our website. All the convictions in all the member states are stated. And some have better rates than others. But you always have to compare that to how many prosecutions there were, how many were led to convictions, and also the estimates of trafficking, because in some cases you have 3 prosecutions, 2 convictions, but very low estimates. In others, you would find that in a country like Romania, we have a lot of convictions, but we also have the highest number of victims identified. So it's very complex, I think, the data. All right.
Okay, Hanzawa.
Yes, and thank you very much, and good morning. I'm really impressed with the knowledge that you have and what you've given us today. I've learned a lot from your presentation and your answers, and I want to draw on that experience that you already have, and I want to ask you perhaps 3 short questions. Is it your experience that victims normally tend to be from their own peoples? And the example, for example, is if you're Chinese, the chances are that you're going to be victimized by the Chinese community. If you're from Asia, it'll be the Asian community. If you're European, it'll be the European community. Is that your experience or not, first of all?
I think it varies. And I think that there's not necessarily a connection. I think that what often happens is that you have organized networks that consist of both EU citizens and people from and citizens of third countries who operate together, and they're happy to recruit anyone who is vulnerable. So do I think that the Ukrainian 13-year-olds that are trafficked for sexual exploitation in Europe are trafficked by Ukrainian traffickers? No. Predominantly, this is not the case. in fact, Europol, if I take Europol as my guidance on this, it identifies that there's about 5 or 6, if you like, nationalities, both from within and outside the EU, that tend to be mostly involved in these human trafficking rings. And then if I look the nationalities of the victims, they don't always correspond. Sometimes they correspond and sometimes they don't. I think it's more a question, it's not about, oh, you're the criminal and you're working against your own people. I think it's a question of finding who is vulnerable. And often we tend to find that you also have a lot more criminality where people are more vulnerable to poverty predominantly. So I don't like to point fingers to people in that way, but I think it's easy to see. These are the 10 countries, and this is what Europol says. It's a public report on the criminal networks. So we have a lot of Chinese networks, Albanian-speaking networks, for example. Europol identifies a Roma community involved. I think, yes, I'm trying to think of some of the other, I think there's Russian networks and so on. So it's both within and outside the EU, but it's public information. I mean, what I know is what I know from Europol. So,
thank you. I think that clearly demonstrates the difficulty in trying to deal with the issue. I think the whole system has moved on. The whole business of this activity has moved on and become more professional, and that leads me on to my second question, and that was, how can you establish a police agency across Europe that can work together with not only themselves as a police agencies, but also with community leaders, because in every community there will be leaders, and I would find it difficult that community leaders wouldn't know what's happening in their backyards. So how can we engage them with the police to try and stamp this out? What would your advice be on that area?
Well, actually, this is the whole ethos of the EU policy at the moment, and the directive is precisely that. So we were saying the policy doesn't work before because if the police, number one, is not trusted and doesn't speak, this is one area, it could be any area, and is not trusted by the respective communities, depending on the country and depending on the context. If it's not trusted and does not work with the NGOs, how far are they going to get? So the whole ethos of the directive, and in fact it is enshrined in the strategy that was mirrored in these council conclusions, is enshrined in our directive, that the stakeholders, and they are identified, they have to work together. So when I was talking before about training that is targeted, is precisely that. It's not for me to go to the police and say, oh, there's human trafficking, but it's precisely to say, this is what needs to be done. This is who you need to work with. This is who you need to reach out to. So I very much agree with you. I think there are some people who know what is going on, others don't. But in any case, I think reaching out to communities, reaching out to even neighborhoods sometimes, or very local authorities, small local authorities, is fundamental. And this is one of the tasks that I am trying to also engage in. I work with regional and local authorities. I mean, there's housing issues. People have, who knows better about housing than your local authority? So if the police doesn't work with the local authority, with the housing authority, and the social worker on this issue, how are we going to get to the bottom of that? So I can only agree with you. So.
You also indicated that this funding was available. What I want to know is 3 things in terms of that funding is, how is that funding to be used? Is it just NGOs? Is it NGOs with the police in collaboration, or is it with NGOs, police and local authorities? And where the funding is available from, and what are the sort of normal target amounts to do a piece of work? Are there any set packages where people don't have to reinvent the wheel, that they can take experience from other people who've done this and they've been successful?
Okay. First of all, let me tell you that whatever I tell you is only valid until the end of 2013, because we have the new financial framework at the EU level to be agreed. Yeah. Having said that, I think in this area, a lot of this, one way or another, will continue. What I was trying to, when I first joined the Commission for this job, it was 2 years ago, my first question is, who is working on trafficking in the European Commission? And they were saying, well, you're here in DG Home, this is where we have a funding program, and is the Home Affairs funding program, and it's dedicated. It is available to member states, to NGOs, to local authorities. They can work separately, they can work together, they can decide how to do this. Funding is normally, it starts from 100,000, but it can be up to 600,000 sometimes, depending. For example, joint investigation teams are expensive. So this is something that normally more money is allocated to. Or like now we're doing something on organ trafficking. Universities are involved, scientists, and so on. So this is more expensive. We have, for example, 5 million allocated each time, and we have 2 calls a year. And as I said, I'm very keen to see this funding diversify and ensure that more stakeholders benefit from that funding. But this is what I knew when I joined the Commission. And then a big, horrifying exercise of mapping where the money is allocated showed me that we have 11 DGs allocating money on trafficking in human beings in different ways. Be that DG development, and I'm sure a similar thing happens in your authorities, in your governments, and so on. That goes to Nigeria, but we didn't know in DG Home. And I think this happens a lot everywhere in administrations. So what we've done is we've collected all of that information. We're going to now analyze exactly how this has worked to inform better policy making. So if I were to tell you how much money was allocated throughout, this will be published because I don't know. I'm not telling you because I don't know. But we're now calculating, and before the end of the year, it will be on the website. Exactly how much money has been given. But if you were to ask somebody to do this job, all the projects are currently on a central website because we felt that it was important for the member states, for the stakeholders to know.
The reason why I'm trying to establish success stories in particular is because we're going to have the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. Like many others, I'm very fearful that during that period of time, there may well be an influx of victims, and we really need to be ready for that. I mean, Scotland prides itself. We would like to think that we're reasonably clean compared to our counterparts across Europe. We would wish to retain that reputation, and therefore I think it's important that we actually engage with your website to try and see and establish success stories so that we can emulate those. So don't be surprised if we come visiting.
Most welcome.
Thank
and
you.
I think it's very important when it comes to large-scale events, especially sporting events. Sometimes we try to undermine, for all sorts of reasons, the importance of that. But there have been a lot of studies. I mean, I don't know a personal case, but there have been a lot of studies to demonstrate that we have to be very, very vigilant indeed. And there have been projects to that effect in the past, and there are the practices in other member states, so it would be good to link up with previous experiences, and we very much welcome that.
It's a very big event for us in terms of history, and therefore we are very nervous to make sure that we cross all the T's and dot all the I's.
Cyprus, so I know that the event is coming up.
Thank you.
Jeannie McGregor, a very quick supplementary.
Yes, the recent financial crisis in the Eurozone has led to enormously high youth unemployment across Europe. In some areas, I saw 56% for Spain, for example, the other day. Now, is there evidence that this huge surge in youth unemployment has led to more trafficking?
I cannot give you the evidence because the data is collected now for the years 2011 and 12. It's now being collected. We send out the questionnaires and we will receive the data. Having said that, I would find it extremely surprising if this is not the case. It would be a pleasant surprise that vulnerable young people do not apply for vague jobs online, advertised on Facebook and whatever it is, that do not end up in situations they do not expect. If you had listened to that guy who spoke at the conference last year, I mean, he was a very well presented, very well spoken, clever young man, maybe 21, 22, who sat there and said, it could happen to any one of you if you lost your jobs. Everybody was just, and it's like that. So I can only assume what you're assuming. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that we've exhausted our questions for you for now. I think we have probably many, many more questions. Can I, on behalf of the committee, thank you very, very much for an absolutely fantastic insight into your job and the work that you've got to do. I think this is an issue that this committee has taken a real keen interest in, and notwithstanding the fact that I'm involved in the cross-party group in trafficking anyway. But I think for us, there's a number of issues that you have brought up today that I think we will take forward as a committee, and I will suggest that course of action to the committee to look at for next week, if you're in agreement to do that. I think there's many things there. I think the points that Jamie had brought up about youth unemployment, I think the funding for awareness-raising campaigns, I think whether the bill actually fully complies is somewhere that we want to go as well. And one of the most horrifying things for me that I've heard from you this morning is that this industry is worth $32 billion. That's just short of our entire, and if it was in pounds, it would be just short of an entire Scottish budget. And that's absolutely unbelievable to think that in billions and billions of dollars like that, where we try to deliver health and education and justice, where other people are using that to fund a criminal lifestyle, is absolutely horrific.
If I may, I think this policy that we have in the legislation, and the reason why the position that I hold at the moment it was created is precisely because organized crime can only be tackled in an organized way and in a coordinated way, and there's no other way about it. So this is the whole ethos of the work that we're trying to do in the new policy that we have launched. So I am very happy and very honored to be with you today, and thank you for all the very detailed questions. I normally get very vague questions about, I don't know. So I'm very happy and honored to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I think just in your point about organised crime, you're absolutely spot on, because when our government talked about a anti-trafficking unit within our police headquarters, and we changed to a single police force recently, so we have that unit set in there. I wanted to know where it was going to be, because I was concerned about the cyber people being here and the other people being here and not together. But that unit was actually placed right in the heart of our serious and organised crime unit, which obviously was absolutely spot on from that point of view. But one of the things that we have to strive for is to ensure that communication it keeps going. And I think for this committee, looking at what the Scottish Government has done thus far and the proposals for what they want to do in the future, and what the UK Government's doing and how we can raise awareness, is probably where we will go on this. So thank you very, very much. We'd be delighted to have you back at committee any time, and I think maybe in the future we will look at the modern slavery bill coming from the UK to see if it complies, because Scots law is slightly different, so we maybe do some of that work there as well. But we'd be delighted to have you back, and certainly we'd be delighted to come and visit you if you wanted to
another visit, because I love this city so much. I keep coming back, so there you go.
We extend an open invitation to you to come to this committee anytime, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
And can I thank everyone for coming along. I think it's generated a lot of interest across Scotland and across the UK, and I know that you've been supported by very excellent people from the Commission office, and we will look forward to seeing you again. So thank you very much. Okay, just finally on the committee agenda for next week, if committee's content, I'm going to bring forward some of the issues raised today for us to allow to take forward some new work on this, specifically chasing up some of the issues with the Scottish Government. Committee content to do that? Yep, Katie will bring back something for next meeting. Okay, and on that, our next meeting is Thursday the 19th of September. I now close this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.